We're going to be covering Douglas County's 2021 community-wide greenhouse gas inventory results, including a little overview on greenhouse gases and the inventory process, and then Eli will take it away with the results. You can go to the next slide. Great, so I just wanted to introduce ourselves. My name is Caroline Dickey. I'm a program officer at ICLEI USA, and then I'm joined by Eli Udall, who's a senior program officer at ICLEI USA. And just in case anyone is less familiar with our organization, we are an NGO that primarily helps local governments with, I like to describe it as anything climate action related. So greenhouse gas accounting, nature-based solutions, kind of anything related to climate action planning and sustainability. And then, so our agenda for the day, I will be starting us off with greenhouse gas and inventory 101, as well as the importance of inventories and forecasting. And then Eli will take it away with the inventory results, as well as some key takeaways and principles. And so diving right in into what is a greenhouse gas, or GHG for short. You'll see that throughout our slides, or we may refer to it that way. So it's good to know what that means. So a greenhouse gas acts like a glass in a greenhouse. That's why it's called that. So it essentially traps the sun's heat near the Earth's surface. And so if you look at this graphic, a more scientific way of looking at it is that solar radiation or energy goes through the atmosphere, and most of it is actually absorbed by Earth, but then some of the solar radiation should be re-emitted back into space. However, greenhouse gases come in and they cause further warming by having that sort of trapping effect. And so greenhouse gas emissions are a result of human activities that we'll dive into a little bit in here shortly, but they're largely responsible for causing climate change. And so there are a few primary types of greenhouse gases that go into an inventory and that we look at for climate change. And so the three primary ones are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. And you'll see we have global warming potentials listed here as well. And those are a part of how we calculate greenhouse gas emissions for communities. So global warming potentials are defined as the heat trapping ability of each greenhouse gas relative to that of CO2. So what that means is, if you take the example of methane, you'll see its global warming potential is 28. So that means that methane is 28 more times potent than CO2 in terms of its heat trapping ability. And then the same would be for nitrous oxide. So it's 265 times more potent than CO2 in terms of global warming potential. So I also just want to note, given the sort of different GWPs of these various greenhouse gas emissions, the world has kind of come to the system where we typically report emissions in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent. And so that's just a unit derived by that equation that I just covered. So it's derived by multiplying a non-CO2 greenhouse gas, so methane or nitrous oxide, by its GWP. And now we can go to the next slide. Great, so what exactly is a community-wide, or in Douglas County's case, county-wide greenhouse gas inventory? It's really just an inventory that accounts for all of the activities that cause emissions within your community. So a lot of the emissions generating activities that are typically included in an inventory are listed here. And actually, Douglas County's inventory covers pretty much all of these except for, I think, off-road equipment. So we'll be talking later about results on stationary energy use. So you can think of any energy source that a building consumes, from electricity, natural gas, to propane in Douglas County's case. And then there's also, and that'll actually be covered in residential, commercial, and industrial sectors. And then there's mobile fuel use, which is going to include all of the gasoline and diesel consumption in your community. So that's mostly on-road vehicles, public transportation, I like to describe it as really any vehicle that moves and consumes a fuel. And then we have industrial processes that cause emissions, solid waste decomposition and combustion, wastewater treatment processes, agriculture, forestry, and other land use, as well as some fugitive emissions. And so how exactly are greenhouse gas emissions calculated? How are we taking all of those activities and coming up with the emissions estimate? It's a fairly simple equation. It's really just your activity data times an emissions factor, and that equals your emissions estimate. And so the activity data is associated with all of those items that I just mentioned. So your activity data is going to be the actual consumption of electricity that your community has, the total consumption in something like kilowatt hours, or it's all of the natural gas consumed. That could be total therms used in Douglas County. And so then the emissions factor is, that factor describes the greenhouse gas intensity of each of those activities. So it's an assigned value to each specific activity that provides a value in terms of carbon dioxide emitted per kilowatt hour. So it's kind of an average number that studies have found, which is how you get your estimated carbon dioxide emitted. Okay, and so now that we've covered kind of all of the background information on what a greenhouse gas inventory is, why is it actually important? So it's a key element of your climate action plan. It provides a baseline for you to project your business as usual emissions. So if you didn't take any action in your community to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, what might they look like in 20 years? It allows you to model potential reduction scenarios. So if you wanted to think about ways that you're reducing vehicle miles traveled for vehicles, you could actually take your emissions inventory and then model reduction scenarios based on that action. It also allows you to make more informed decisions on mitigation. So as you're coming up with the kind of high impact actions that you use in your climate action plan, it helps decide on those, and just a lot more listed here. I don't think I need to cover all of them. So one more slide on why it's important. And this is kind of a key takeaway, I think. It allows you to create emissions reductions targets, and more specifically, science-based targets. And so these are measurable, actionable, and time-bound climate targets. So science-based targets are, they were created by climate scientists thinking about Earth's limits on 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. So to stay within that boundary of 1.5 degrees C, the world needs to reduce emissions 50% by 2030 and reach net zero emissions by 2050. So communities aligning with science-based targets allows them to think globally, and why we are all taking this action, why we all need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really about those broader societal sustainability goals. And I think before I actually pass it off to Eli, I might pause for questions just to make sure everybody understands what's going on in a greenhouse gas inventory before we cover the results. So any questions related to all of that?
Yeah, hi, my name is Mike Wazakowski. I chair the Public Trains Advisory Committee. Could we go back to the slide that talked about the different things that you accounted for in that? There was one thing that I was kind of curious about that I didn't see in terms of mobile fuel use. That I don't know if there's necessarily an impact from it, but I've read recently about a lot of studies looking at tire particulates, like the waste that comes off of that in terms of vehicles. I don't know if does that have any impact on this at all? Or have you looked into whether that would have an impact on greenhouse emissions?
So not for, sorry, Eli, go ahead.
No. I was gonna say, I think that'd be more of a kind of a air quality health impact concern than a greenhouse gas concern.
Okay, thank you very much.
I would interject here that would be some externalized greenhouse gas that is actually created somewhere else in the manufacture of the tires and the plastics. I mean, tires are primarily plastic, And so when they make the tires, when they create those plastics, that's where the greenhouse gas emissions take place, even though the use takes place here. It's one of those areas that kind of skews some of the data.
Mhm. Okay, thank you for that conversation.
Any other major greenhouse gas accounting related questions?
I do have a question about the agricultural sector. What kind of, activities, I think you referred to it, does that cover? I mean, there's obviously tractor fuels, fuels for delivering materials and taking materials to market. What about refrigeration? What about chemical inputs into, the fertilizers and things like that? What are all the activities that were covered under agriculture?
So we will be diving into Douglas County's more specific inventory in just a moment. So maybe hold off on that question for now, because
Sure, great.
Eli will cover that. Well, I think we can probably move on to Eli's portion then. And obviously you can ask more questions at the end if more come up related to the inventory process.
Great, thanks, Caroline. All right, so starting with kind of the high level results, the major sectors are the residential energy, commercial energy, and transportation. And these are pretty typical of what we see in most communities, is to have these three sectors in some orders as the largest sources of emissions in community. And just to kind of provide a reminder, so the residential energy there, we're looking at electricity use in homes and multifamily residential buildings. We're looking at natural gas use in those buildings, as well as we included propane use. And the commercial energy would be, looking at commercial buildings and electricity and natural gas use in those. And then the transportation and mobile sources. So that is all your on-road vehicles, both passenger vehicles, as well as kind of those larger trucks, freight vehicles, delivery trucks, etc. So looking at all of that, and then we did capture a little bit of the transit fleet in the region as well. I'll say we captured all of it, but it was a little bit compared to all the other vehicles that are there. So that's the main sources, and then we have industrial energy use, agriculture, solid waste, processed fugitive water and wastewater, and those kind of collectively added up to about another 20% of the inventory. Next slide, please. So this is kind of a more detailed table. I don't want to spend a long time going through all of this, but we can certainly refer back to it as needed. And maybe it's a good time to take on that question about agriculture. So things like vehicles that are delivering needed inputs to agriculture, or taking crops away from farmers, delivering those to wherever they need to go. Those vehicles are if they're operating on the roads, those are captured in that transportation. We did not get data on off-road vehicles, so tractors would not actually be included in this inventory. Energy like electricity, natural gas use on farms, for in those buildings, refrigeration, etc. That would show up either under industrial or commercial energy. I'd say most likely under commercial in most cases. So those kind of the way that we got that data from the utilities, it didn't break out like an agricultural user from other commercial users. And then so what we actually include specifically in the agriculture sector is methane that's coming, and you'll see that word. Whoop, go back. Thank you. Enteric fermentation, which is a fancy word for cow farts, because they produce methane. And then we have manure management, so various kinds of animals, their manure can produce methane. And then we also have crop residues on kind of in the soil, and leftover can produce that third greenhouse gas that we look at, nitrous oxide. So we kind of estimates kind of for the agriculture happening in the region of those kind of more direct agricultural emissions. Again, energy use for agriculture would go in the commercial energy, and or if it's on-road vehicles supporting the agriculture, that's under transportation. Let's see, one other thing I just kind of wanted to cover here, when we look at electricity, so we look at that kind of those emissions associated with where the electricity is being used, rather than kind of at the point of the generation. So Jamie had mentioned that there are 2 coal power plants in the county. Those power plants are not just serving the county, but are like going into a wider region, a wider grid. And so actually, kind of the method we use, all the generation that we got emissions factors for each utility. So, whatever sources of generation that they have, each one had probably some coal, some natural gas, some wind. Some of them I know had some hydro. There may be some nuclear in there. So all that kind of gets averaged out to produce an average emissions factor for electricity from that utility, and then that gets multiplied by the energy that's consumed in the county. All right, so I think that's good for this slide. We can go on to the next one. All right, so yes, I wanted to mention we did also look at sequestration from forest and trees. And essentially, if you have kind of a large area with trees that's contiguous, that's called a forest. And if you have trees that are more individually spaced, whether in fields or around houses, those are considered trees outside of forests. So we estimated a sequestration associated with both of those. And you'll see that we kind of report a total gross emission. So that's before we look at any of that sequestration, because we want to be counting and thinking about what is all the emissions that are actually being produced in the county. And then we do also have kind of that net number after that's subtracted. You see that the trees are absorbing just a little bit more than 10% of the total gross emissions from the county. Next slide, please. I think actually we can, it's just another table of the same information we've looked over, so we can go to the next slide. All right, so that's the inventory. That's kind of looking at, in that baseline year, what was happening. And then we also look forward to what we would expect with emissions of forecast. So we call this a business as usual scenario. So this is kind of before any of the actions that you're looking at in your plan. We want to see where our emissions are going. So we look at the expected population growth in the county. And then there's a couple other things that we look in that are kind of outside what you all are trying to do, that we already are reasonably sure are going to happen. So one is the main utility serving the county, Evergy, has this goal to reduce their emissions 70% below 2005 in 2030. They've already reduced some percentage, so we accounted for that and figure out what is the additional reduction we would expect there. Recognizing that Evergy produces most of supplies most of the electricity, but they're not all of it. There are these other utilities, so we kind of adjusted for that. And the other thing we look at is kind of what's on the books already as far as federal vehicle efficiency requirements, and how those vehicles becoming more efficient will reduce those transportation emissions. So those things are incorporated in what we call the business as usual forecast. And then separately, you all could look at, individual actions and how those would further reduce that. So next slide, please. All right, so this is what that business as usual forecast looks like. So again, starting with that 2021 baseline, this is looking forward to 2030. And we see, based on, that kind of additional reductions that Evergy is projecting in their emissions, as well as the federal CAFE standards, that does kind of have a more significant effect than the population growth. That kind of more than offsets the population growth, getting this like 15.5% decrease before we look at additional actions. Next slide, please. All right, so we did some analysis around, and Caroline talked about kind of this science-based target, why it's important globally to be trying to reach these targets that are aligned with that 1.5 degrees to minimize those climate impacts, keeping them from getting too much worse than they already are. And so this analysis here is based, this is not based on anything kind of the input that you all have been collecting. This is just kind of, we have some standardized types of actions that we, apply across communities. So we just did some really high level analysis on those to give you an idea of some different things and how those could affect emissions. You can see with kind of grid decarbonization there at the top, getting a cleaner electric grid is, really one of the most significant things that can be done to reduce emissions. And then also we see reducing vehicle miles traveled, transition to electric vehicles, efficiency in buildings, as well as electrification of buildings, other kind of some of those big buckets that can have a significant impact on the emissions. All right, next slide, please. So key takeaways, just kind of recap the commercial energy and residential energy, the largest emitting sectors, the transportation very close to those. So each of those kind of about the same size, and together accounting for about 80% of the emissions. Then we have the other sectors: industrial energy use, agriculture, solid waste, processed fugitive, and water and wastewater kind of contributing the remaining 20%. So, kind of thinking about this, and I think this aligns pretty well with the kinds of things that have already been coming out of your planning, looking at reducing vehicle miles traveled, shifting to electric vehicles. Collaboration is going to be really key, because that grid emissions, grid electricity production is so important, and is not something that the county has control over. But we have Evergy, as well as some of the smaller utilities and some of those municipals, continuing to be engaged with all of them to support that transition to renewable energy there. And then to look for ways to reduce natural gas usage as another one of those major sources of emissions, looking both at efficiency and electrification there. All right, next slide, please. All right, and I think this is our last one. Just some of our key principles. Programs should take a holistic approach, including health, resilience, and equity. And we know you're already doing that. It's great to hear about the kind of the approach you've taken there. Just want to emphasize that emissions reductions are urgent. That's why we recommend you at least consider that 2030 science-based target. planning should incorporate rapidly changing trends. And so there's, a lot of things have changed, and I've been involved in this climate work for about 15 years now, and have really seen the prices on solar power and wind power have come down so much that it has really changed tremendously kind of how those are looked at, and what is possible in terms of really changing the grid. We see electric vehicles just in the past year, so many new models being introduced, and new manufacturing being built to support the batteries and the electric vehicles, that transition is really accelerating. So, we want to kind of be aware and keep on top of those things as we plan to be taking advantage of those changes. Again, local government can't do it alone. This is kind of a broader collaborative effort, working with the state and utilities and other communities in your region and in state. And then finally, the inventory certainly is one of many inputs into your planning process, and it's great again to see you have such broad public engagement. But the inventory also is an important piece for informing those decisions, and for that monitoring of your emissions over time. All right, and I think that is the last slide in our section.